The 53rd chapter of the book of Isaiah is regarded by virtually all Christians as a key text prophesying the coming of the Messiah who would suffer and die for the sins of the world and be risen again on the third day. This is probably the most frequently cited book of the Hebrew Bible when it comes to messianic prophecies about Jesus and what he came to earth to do in Christianity. So I thought it'd be worth just having a look at what biblical scholars have said about Isaiah 53 and what the text actually says. And to do that, I will refer again to this book, The Bible, a historical and literary introduction by Professor Bart Ehrman, who is an expert on the Bible. This is published by Oxford University Press. And an example of the reviews on the back from Baylor University in the States, it says, "This book is a high-quality work of current scholarship and thoughtful presentation. The textbook presents a wealth of information in a style that engages students and encourages them to go to the primary text," meaning the Bible. And I can certainly agree that it is very readable. Now, I'm going to look at Bart Ehrman's comments on Isaiah. I just want to stress one thing. He's not just giving his personal opinions here. What he says, I happen to know, represents probably the most widely held view in biblical scholarship. So it's not a maverick view or a liberal view. It's a very standard view that's held by experts across the spectrum. Although, of course, you're free to query and disagree if you wish. So he offers his comments on Isaiah 53, which I think are really important, as I say, representing probably the majority view, the consensus view of biblical studies. And he says on this, in a section headed "The Suffering Servant," no passage of 2nd Isaiah has intrigued readers and interpreters, especially among Christians, more than the 4 passages that are dedicated to describing a figure known as the suffering servant. Some commentators have called these passages songs or songs of the suffering servant. The passages are Isaiah 42, 1-4, Isaiah 49, 1-6, Isaiah 50, 4-11, and famously Isaiah 52:13 through to Isaiah 53:12. Scholars debate whether these passages were composed at the same time as the rest of the book, or whether, instead, they existed independently of the book, possibly composed by the author himself, and were then incorporated into the book in 4 places. In these passages, the servant of Yahweh is said to have suffered horribly for the sake of others, but God will vindicate him. He, in fact, is the delight of Yahweh and will be used by him to accomplish his will on earth. Quote, "I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not grow faint or be crushed until he has established justice on the earth." Isaiah 42, 1-4. The author believes that this unnamed servant shall prosper. He shall be exalted and lifted up. Isaiah 52:13. But the most important, impressive, and well-known comments about the servant involve his horrible suffering for the sake of others. These comments have been highly important since the times of the New Testament, because Christian readers have widely thought that Isaiah was describing the crucifixion of Jesus for the sins of the world. And then Bart Ehrman quotes from Isaiah 53, and I'll read it from my New Revised Standard Version. And it says this: "He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity, and as one from whom others hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him of no account. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases, yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." End quote. And Bar Ehrman continues, "The author goes on to say that the servant was silent before his oppressors, that he was cut off from the land of the living, and that he made his tomb with the rich, and that it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain." Doesn't this sound exactly like Jesus? Isn't this a prophecy about what would happen to the Messiah? In response to that common Christian interpretation, several important points are to be made, he says. Number one, it is to be remembered that the prophets of the Hebrew Bible were not predicting things that were to happen hundreds of years in advance. They were speaking to their own contexts and delivering a message for their own people to hear about their own immediate futures. 2. In this case, the author is not predicting that someone will suffer in the future for people's sins at all. Many readers fail to consider the verb tenses in these passages. They do not indicate that someone will come along at a later time and suffer in the future. They are talking about a past suffering. The servant has already suffered, although he will be vindicated. And so this is not about a future suffering Messiah. 3. In fact, it is not about the Messiah at all. This is a point frequently overlooked in discussions of the passage. If you will look, you will notice that the term Messiah never occurs in the passage. This is not predicting what the Messiah will be. 4. If the passage is not referring to the Messiah and is not referring to someone in the future who is going to suffer, whom is it talking about? Here there really should be very little ambiguity. As I mentioned, this particular passage, Isaiah 53, is one of the 4 servant songs of 2nd Isaiah. I'll just pause here. Why does Bar Ehrman refer to 2nd Isaiah? Now, this is to do with the fact that biblical historians have noticed the following about the whole book of Isaiah. That even though most of the text is rooted in the prophet called Isaiah, who lived in Judah during about 800 years BC, it's also widely believed the prophet did not write the entire book. And some of the reasons for this is that chapters 40 through to 55, if you read them, they seem to presuppose that Jerusalem has already been destroyed. And they're not framed as prophecy, and the Babylonian exile has already happened. They speak from a present in which the exile is about to end. So that wouldn't be 800 years BC. And chapters 56 to 66 assume an even later situation in which the temple, in which the people have already returned to Jerusalem and are rebuilding the temple. And also, strangely, Isaiah's name suddenly stops being used after chapter 39. So scholars have, and there are other reasons as well, to do with the style and content of the theology, which seems to be quite different later on than it is from Isaiah chapters 1 to 39. So that first block, Isaiah 1 through to 39, is called First Isaiah in biblical scholarship. Second Isaiah are the chapters after that, written by an unknown scribe, probably centuries later, who added his words, added the text to the prophet Isaiah's original prophecy. Anyway, that's a short diversion. So to continue from Bar Ehrman, as I mentioned, this particular passage, Isaiah 53, is one of the 4 servant songs of 2nd Isaiah. And so the question is, whom does 2nd Isaiah himself indicate that the servant is? And this is the question. Who is this servant? A careful reading of the passages makes the identification quite clear, says Bar Ehrman. But now hear, O Jacob, my servant, Israel, whom I have chosen. Isaiah 44 verse 1. Remember these things, O Jacob and Israel, for you are my servant. Isaiah 44:21. And he said to me, you are my servant, Israel, in whom I will be glorified. Isaiah 49 verse 3. The book of 2nd Isaiah itself indicates who the servant of the Lord is. It is Israel, God's people. Isaiah 53, when the author describes the servant's past sufferings, he is talking about the sufferings they have experienced by being destroyed and exiled by the Babylonians. This is a suffering that has come about because of sins, but the suffering will be vindicated because God will now restore Israel and bring them back to the land and enter into a new relationship with them. It may be fairly objected that the servant is said to suffer for our sins, not for his sins. Scholars have resolved that problem in a number of ways. It may be that the author is thinking that the portion of the people taken into exile have suffered for the sins of those in the land, some of them suffering for the sins of all. Those who have been taken into captivity have suffered displacement, loss, and exile for the sake of the sins of the nation. But now the servant, Israel, will be exalted and restored to a close relationship with God and will be used by him to bring about justice throughout the earth. There may be problems with this interpretation, as there always are with every interpretation, but the fact remains that the suffering servant is never described as the Messiah. His suffering is portrayed as a past instead of future event, and he is explicitly identified on several occasions as Israel. Later readers who have taken the passage as a reference to the Messiah, then, have seen Jesus as one who fills out or fulfills its original meaning, giving it a new meaning that it did not originally have. End quote. So there we have it. I know from my own research that what Bart Ehrman is explaining there is the standard scholarly view. There are some scholars who identify the suffering servant as Jeremiah or even Isaiah himself, but it's not seen as a prediction of Jesus Christ, Messiah from the future, because that's not what the passage says. So I hope you find that of interest, and I do welcome your comments and criticisms. Until next time.